thank you, Leiden University, for organizing this very, very timely event. Next week marks the 100 days since the last year's troop left. Past week was the 100 days of what happened in terms of collapse of the government. Interestingly, it also marks the week, the 5th of December, where in 2001, an interim government was agreed upon to begin a new chapter for Afghanistan 2 years next door in Bonn, in Germany. So the timing is very both symbolic and meaningful personally to me and to a lot of people in Afghanistan also. This new chapter was to be written with the hopes and aspiration of a majority of Afghans and supported unprecedentedly by a coalition of international civilian and military at the time when it began. The coalition, as we all know, was shaped by this global outrage of 9/11 attacks, terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda against the United States. The primary driver of this unique collective effort began in December 2001 at Bonn by so many countries was driven by the national security concerns of the US and its key allies. It also, as we know now, became a test for 21st century's first international cooperation in global security, with a growing focus, of course, with the non-state terrorist groups, a new phenomenon that morphed even more since then into different shapes and nature. Afghanistan's stabilization, democratization, and promoting of shared ideals of human rights and justice and democracy was also defined as part of this intervention as essential and at times the core element of objectives of this international collective effort. However, it's mostly known and assessed and talked about it as, quote unquote, the 20-year-long war today. The major international engagement on social, economic, and political development that cannot be as depressing as the way the military test ended is not talked much these days about, and considered the same way as the military defeat and lost. It's seen that probably the socio-economic and political development that occur also lost and gone. For me personally, I say it's meaningful because these days, 20 years ago, I was at the center of it, being engaged as part of the discussion in Bonn. And also for somebody who's seen inside the government, outside the government, civil society, as a critique of the government and being part of the government, the different roles I've seen from different perspectives, that the entire but different phases of this intervention of international engagement, regional behavior, and our own domestic attitude and development. The first phase, I see it as beginning from December 2001 to end of 2004. That phase, I see it as a full international consensus, both regional and internationally, both on security and civilian and direction that Afghanistan could have taken. As the youngest delegate at the UN peace talks for Afghanistan in Bonn at that time, the very same days in December in Bonn, Germany, I witnessed that the venue that was provided was not only a convening place for Afghan groups to discuss the transition arrangement and the composition of the new government and the future of the country, but it was very much an assembly of representatives from a large number of countries, some of them staunch rival to each other on other issues or bilateral issues, but they had consensus, full consensus, on the way and direction of stabilization, peace, and democratic agenda for Afghanistan. Iran and United States, as an example. At times later on, when I visited the United Nations headquarters at the General Assembly time, those days at Bonn was looking exactly like it. Every single country almost was there, and the representatives were all working on one common agenda. And this was the peak of international consensus, both in Afghanistan and in views of many observers and experienced diplomats. It was unprecedented and unique in an international intervention of that nature. While international development and military aid was still limited at the beginning of this phase, within the first 3 years, Afghanistan achieved major milestones on stability, democratization, and promotion of human rights, with the adoption of a new constitution as its foundation, and the first presidential and parliamentary election, 2005-2004, as the demonstration of collective desire of post-Bonn democratic order in Afghanistan. In my view, two key factors made the rapid and foundational progress possible at the time that could be looked in more detail in the future. First, a lesson that was learned, one of the first factor, I believe, was the 5 December 2001 Bonn Agreement itself served as the blueprint for the newly established government and its international partner. The roadmap created predictability for almost 3 years. The division of labor between international partners and an Afghan side was clear. A roadmap with urgent and important tasks that could be achievable and not over ambitious that existed as part of this blueprint. The future years, while there was this Afghanistan national development strategies, but they become unrealistic, over ambitious, expanded documents that was not possible to be achieved in a sustainable way. And therefore, a difference between the first 3 years and the following years is coming from that. And also a lesson that the following years with these national strategy plans, there wasn't much of a political buy-in into it. The consultation did not include political actors, but more of international actors, and the division of labor was minimally defined as part of it. The second key factor at the time for the success of that first year was the leadership of the United Nations through its very high-profile special representative, Ambassador Brahimi, with a strong mandate that he received and endorsed by the UN Security Council. His role and the role of a special representative of Secretary General was very critical, both on the political development side of the issues, but also on coordination of all of the international partners' efforts on civilian work and developmental aid. The second phase, the characteristic of it, of course, is the first one begins to show regional divergences from the international consensus. We see a re-emergence of violence. We also, as a key characteristic of that time, especially at the last part of it, was the surge. And then also the emergence of this vocabulary among international partners, Afghan good enough, minimizing the expectations. So the period between 2005 to 2011 covers most of these. Some of these happened especially soon after US intervention of Iraq in 2003, where it diverted attention and civil and military resources from Afghanistan. Regional actors began to break the international consensus over Afghanistan. And therefore, their strategic calculus began to change. As an example, strategic calculus in Iran vis-a-vis US presence in Afghanistan begin to change and partially start being defined by the fear that there is this quote-unquote grand design to encircle Iran. And therefore, that fear-driven new sets of policies there toward Afghanistan. The second, of course, Pakistan is already known, spoken about it a lot. Pakistan already engaged in regrouping and rearming the Taliban who escaped after the collapse of their regime. ISI began providing safe houses, supplies, and advice to the Taliban elements. And then Pakistan's double-sided operations, with one being openly part of the international coalition and receiving aid and support from the United States and the rest of the coalition forces, both on the war against terror and other issues, but also clandestinely empowering the Taliban to inflict harm on Afghan and international partners. For Pakistan, the post-Bonn order began to look like that it is built on some strong national ideals, including the constitution aspired by the and built on the 1964 constitution, the flag, the nationalist flag, and reclaiming of the glory of jihad against Soviet without giving that credit to Pakistan. And that's also an area where the nervousness began to increase. It was then seen as a departure of Afghanistan from what Pakistan desired to be a religious identity to be promoted to Afghanistan, and what they desired to have said in one of the morning panels, friendly regime to secure its western border. So it saw a departure from that point, from religious state to identity to more of a nationalist identity, which Pakistan did not desire. With this, domestically, the international military operation expanded with the increase in the level of violence, as we know, and then more arrests, more torture, more people to Guantanamo and fire bases, detention facilities, more civilian casualty, provided more ground for recruitment of the Taliban. And then the safe havens and civilian casualty for the Taliban start to become subject of tension between the United States and Afghan government at that time. The third phase, the characteristic of it, few of them are combined with fatigue with the mission, drawdown, beginning of it, and expansion, and then end of the military presence, escalation of violence, and the US Taliban Doha peace process, and of course, the last landmark characteristic of it, the collapse of the government. So 2011 to 2021 is that third phase that I see a lot of indicators and characteristics and events happening with similarity and shaping a direction for the country. So as part of that phase, we had the initial peace efforts by Obama administration and government of Germany, and then the first opening political office of Taliban in Doha, which failed to achieve any negotiation, but a resumption of it in 2018 by the Trump administration and the subsequently the 29th February Doha agreement that created a lot of base for where we are today, which I will come quickly there. Second, issues on human rights and democratization quietly slept off the talking points of contributing countries. In the previous phases, there was a lot of visits by foreign dignitaries and especially foreign ministers, members of parliament, congress people from the United States and other places. Human rights and democratization was at least one of the three key important talking points of most of these dignitaries and foreign senior officials visiting the country. In this last phase, most of them dropped these emphasis on the key ideals and shared ideals from their talking points to press the Afghan government on the importance of this. When you look at the UN Security Council's resolutions on Afghanistan annually, you could see that from the 2001 1389 Security Council resolution, following that the 1400 resolution of the United Nations Security Council, where human rights has a prominent place, at least one of the 5 key items at the top of the resolution. And it was a practice all the way up until 2011. And 2011 began to slip, and the resolutions started to have human rights issues as a sub-issue to the last sub-item, or to the last item of the Security Council resolution. And it was much to do both with lowering significantly the expectation of international partners and actors, but also with the inaction of some of the internationals, or a collective of the international partners, especially the Europeans, who always championed the human rights cause, to not use the opportunity, if they were pen holders in drafting of the Security Council resolution, to press for or use the leverage to press for those ideals or values to be still at the top of the Security Council's resolution. And then the final element and factor that almost brings us to a circle is the US-Taliban Doha agreement. The last phase also marks the first transition of power from one president to another through an election. So of course, election was disputed and a lot of issues, but also there was that element of does the democratization effort worked or not, and where it didn't and where it did. So of course, the military drawdown and complete withdrawal from Afghanistan, another key feature of this period. The Doha Taliban agreement elevated the Taliban, emboldened them, and provided them with a platform to expand both militarily but also politically significantly. And as a result of all of this, coupled with us as the former government, Afghan government, we failed, among other things, because of the short-sightedness of the leadership and the leaders throughout, and the absence of a broad-based and realistic decision-making. We were putting positions, as an example, on peace that was unrealistic, and then we were expecting, especially, we had a tendency to look to international community to deliver a lot of on a lot of key issues. Now, with all of this, what happened in this third phase, at the end of it, we came a full circle of building state from ashes of a collapsed state. Then the state grown and become a resemblance of a public sector that could deliver services and could operate. And then slowly going back to the failed state, and then coming back after 2 decades to a collapsed state. Now, that requires a lot of postmortem and a lot of careful looking on each of these elements and how each phases contributed to this coming of the circle. Now, quickly, if I may go to the lessons learned for EU, the question, is it all lost? The 20 years of investment? Yes, there are fundamental failures on one hand, in terms of democratic political processing, building institutions that could survive and could last. And now that entire project of the past 20 years, because the state collapsed, is gone. But the investment on social side of things did not is not a lost thing. It exists there, and there's many other issues in terms of both normative, institutional, and social, and political issues that changed Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is not lost in that area. Now, in terms of human rights, to take one of the key areas as an example, we forget that how much of a progress was made. Normatively, apart from the constitution, large bodies of laws produced over the past 20 years, all with human rights protection and promotion mechanisms or elements within it. International conventions, including CEDAW and optional protocol against torture, which last year was Afghanistan signed to it, become tools that will stay and exist for Afghanistan, and Afghanistan has an obligation internationally to adhere no matter who and what is in Kabul. So that's not lost, and it did create this normative space. Then institutionally, the National Human Rights Commission became a major institution that operated and become a very good example of best practices in conflict scenarios and situation. The institutional setup, but also the practices it created, both for Afghanistan and for other similar scenarios, is a valuable asset that remains. Human rights and democracy, discourse became a normal and dominant part of the social and political culture of Afghanistan, and it still is, and it is in the different layers of the society, and it can't be taken so easily back to a setback. Again, institutionally, media and civil society, including women's rights groups, have grown both in numbers and professionalism and strength, and there are so many strong civil society leaders and media leaders and women's rights leaders that they continue to fight. As an example, even in the past 3 months, repetitively being on the streets in Kabul and other cities, demanding and fighting for their rights. That's where an area that's not lost, and it is there. In terms of state building in relation between center and local administration, there is new definition and discourses that have emerged that could not be easily diminished in that sense. A highly centralized state for long, and then the evolution of it in terms of discussion and discourse and part of the political culture in terms of accountability and more authority to the local level. Now, these are what it did not lost in terms of, for the sake of short time, in terms of examples that what we could still be hopeful of. Now, a key lesson there in terms of expanding on these and on these gains could be an absence of meaningful mutual accountability mechanisms that go beyond those matrices, complex matrices of development workers that were in paper sheets, and a much more broad sets of priorities at the same time to be looked at it. And it did not exist between the stakeholders, the Afghan stakeholders and international partners. And it did not translate most of the time into key political messaging from the partners. And now, for the EU, in terms of key lessons, some of the key lessons learned, European Union as a separate entity, plus its member states, was contributing almost $1 billion annually, with Germany, with the largest contributor, and other countries also. And it was the second largest contributor to the development of Afghanistan. However, the amount of leverage and its influence could not be seen proportionately in terms of key agendas. As an example, you could see politically this amount of the financial contribution was not regularly and proportionately used in pursuit of certain directions of EU's priority. As an example, number of EU senior officials, including member states' foreign ministers and defense ministers visiting Afghanistan, have declined significantly since 2012, and especially with, as an example, when Netherlands pulled the troops and a number of other countries pulled the troops, while they had small number of troops on ground, but then the number of visits of senior officials have declined significantly, and therefore the political leverage with it have gone certainly low. The EU also could not carry its influence on the direction of some of the agenda setting priorities domestically, also because of absence of a coherence into the different missions that existed on the ground. They were rarely a démarche on key policy issues to Afghan administration. And certainly on the key issues, because the expectation went down from human rights and democratization agendas. So especially on those agendas, especially on the third phase, there've been less and less collective influence by the European Union and member states. So a key lesson there is to make sure that there is always a proportionality between, especially in circumstances where there's this heavy engagement and one of the top foreign intervention collectively of the EU, that what kind of a harmony between all the member states could be created, and the EU as the coordinator and as a mobilizer of collective effort to be proportionately exert the leverage on priority areas. That was missing. And then the second reason, another reason probably was first lack of proper syncing of EU key priorities and priorities by each member state, and therefore the leverage was mostly divided on some of the member state individual sets of priorities. For example, it was obvious that the human rights would be an area where EU would be the champion and would be its priority, but in Afghanistan, for example, the EU special envoy or representative for human rights, that's an instrument within the EU, was not much known. There was rarely heard on major human rights issues from EUSR on human rights. So that dedicated mechanism was not much utilized. It was also not clear what tools the EU as an entity would have apart from conditioning development aid to press the partners in Kabul on some of the key policy issues. So more clarity and more communication of that clarity in terms of positioning and tools that would be used is also something that probably needs to be looked at it more. This absence of clarity where EU stand was very much obvious between 2017 and 2020, like until almost to the end, to April 2021. First, and the Trump administration, I was firsthand witnessing that there was that the EU member state and EU representative would struggle that where they stand, as an example, vis-a-vis this unilateral decision by the United States that they're talking with the Taliban, reaching to an agreement, and finally unilaterally announcing that we are withdrawing. Was it the same level of ambiguity and clarity between the leaders at the EU and the leaders of the United States? One, the nature and the type of the relation that former President Trump had could be understandable, but it did not help, or at least I hope it helped while not at the beginning it did not help, but later on I hope it helped to force EU to make independent decisions on some of the key issues. Throughout the past 20 years, in most burning issues, EU would follow what the United States would do. And then independent decision-making on key policy issues were missing to be seen as the EU unique or niche and in this key areas. Now, as the EU looks to the future and taking Asia as a part of the world that takes a lot of attention or engagement of the EU, probably the second largest part of its attention goes to Asia after its immediate neighbors. And Afghanistan being part of that Asia and Asia, we have Ukraine, and there's more engagement and continuous engagement. There are tension some time, and hopefully not, will expand between Tajikistan and some of its neighbors on some of the key issues. So the potential for future interventions and conflicts exists there, and therefore some of these lessons need to be taken on board. I see 4 areas where the EU has to develop its own independent strategy to deal with and not to be dependent on US, and it really needs to define it and communicate its tool based on which EU would be pursuing those goals. In terms of the tools, is it aid, economic sanctions or not, and in which situation there are? And in terms of economic financial sanction, would it be still dependent on US Treasury for financial sanctions, or it has its own independent ways of dealing with it? The 4 areas, of course, it is first terrorism, that it is part of the deliberation and discussion, but in most of those discussions, terrorism and counterterrorism is still being dependent to measures that the United States would be taking, from now above the horizon operations in Afghanistan to other efforts. It's yet to be seen that unique EU counterterrorism policy and tools are being developed. That probably required further thinking. Counter narcotics from Afghanistan, that today is a group with the drought and everything else. There's a lot of focus of the poor farmers because they can't grow anything else, that there's more narcotics opium being produced. And that an immediate, as you all know, immediate place is Europe, and what kind of a counter narcotics effort is there? And then the migration, both as a result of the conflict and increased level of poverty, but also bad governance and environmental issues that causes further migration. So in this future focus, it will be good, as an example, while looking into Afghanistan and similar scenarios, to keep in mind that while the discussion on Afghanistan has shifted from protecting the democratic gains to the democratic gains of the past 20 years to a looming humanitarian crisis, in that focus, don't forget that many capacities as a result of the investment of 20 years do exist back in Afghanistan. They mostly are non-governmental. Yes, the UN is helping with a lot of things, but it cannot, taking the size of its bureaucracy, taking the overhead cost. It's important to look that those investments that were made are still created capacities that need to be utilized in situations like that. But also, most importantly, to take note of and stand in solidarity with those brave women and men marching on daily basis, almost on the streets of Kabul and other cities, repeatedly raising their voices for a better Afghanistan. That's where EU is known. That's where, as a recipient in Afghanistan, I've seen and I can see that can be defined, can define EU as the place to look at it, and when it comes to human rights, to women's rights and democratic principles. And that's where we'll keep having the EU on the higher moral ground, building on that. So it won't be easy to help people and indigenous forces of advocating human rights, women's rights, and democratization. But in long term, it will give result, and it will be much more better than choosing an easy way of ceding more legitimacy to a group that the population, like Afghanistan, scenarios like Afghanistan, did not choose as their leader, the Taliban, until they earn that.